Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. My name is Chris Ely. I'm the Director of Research at the Global Business Travel Association, and I'm excited to be here today to host the annual webinar we have on the Global Business Travel Index. This is one of our key signature annual research studies that we produce every year. And I'm joined today by two of my colleagues. We have John Gray, who is the principal at an economic research firm called Rockport Analytics, and also Edward Galvin, who is the VP and head of North America B2B commercial payment sales for Visa, who will be walking you through some of the key findings today of the BTI. And I want to thank Visa for its sponsorship of this important study. We've been working with partnering with Visa for several years. And so thank you all. Thank Visa very much for this. Without Visa, this would likely not be possible. So thank you very much for your sponsorship. And now I'm going to turn it over to John and Edward, who are going to walk you through some of the key findings of the study. And please go ahead and put any questions you might have in the Q&A box. And at the end, we'll have some Q&A as well, some time for Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to John and Edward. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining here today. Very excited to be here to talk about the results of this year's Global BTI study with my friend and colleague, Edward Galvin. I do want to add my thank you to Visa and Edward and his team for their sponsorship. As Chris said, without that, this would not be possible. They've been a great partner, and so thank you all very much. So we've got a lot to cover today. I'm going to kind of dive right in. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about what the Global BTI is. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the study, with our reports, have maybe attended a session at convention or somewhere else on the BTI, but the BTI stands for the Business Travel Index. And so essentially what we've done is we've gone out and tried to track every dollar that's spent on business travel globally. We've been doing this now, we're in our 17th year of conducting this study. We're looking to track business travel spend, whether it's managed travel, whether it's unmanaged. We're looking at corporate or large company spending. We're looking at medium-sized enterprises, small companies. We don't care if that travel was booked necessarily on a corporate card, on a personal card, how it was paid for. Essentially, we want to measure those travel expenditures. So we're doing this by drilling down into 72 different country level markets around the world. And then we go a step further within each of those 72 markets, and we look at business travel expenditures by industry sector. And so we've got 44 individual industries in each of those countries where we're measuring business travel spend. And so, as I mentioned, we've been doing this now, we're in our 17th year, but our data goes all the way back to the year 2000. So we've got a data set that's about 25 years in length now. And so it allows us to do some really cool things, not just look at the trends in the data, but also test and model the correlation in those trends against other factors, whether those are macroeconomic factors, other policy factors, other industry-based factors, and see how those things are shaping business travel expenditures around the globe. And so then those models allow us to extrapolate and look a few years in the future. And so we're going to be talking today about where we see business travel headed over the next few years. I should also mention that for the last couple of years, we've also done a study of global business travelers. In this past year, we surveyed over 7,000 business travelers from around the globe to get some additional insight from the traveler perspective. And Edward is going to be taking you through some of those results here in a few minutes. So before we look forward, want to take a look back at 2024. So this is obviously our last full calendar year that we have accounted for in terms of travel expenditures. And so you can see here that we reached nearly $1.5 trillion spent around the globe on business travel last year. You can see here where those expenditures occurred by region. And so nearly 95% of those expenditures, I think about 94%, happened in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Another 3.6% of those expenditures in Latin America. And then we saw 2% of expenditures in the Middle Eastern and African nations. Very important to note here that we are taking an origin view of business travel. So all the numbers that we're going to be talking about this morning have to do with where that trip originated. So obviously, domestic travel in each of these markets is accounted for in that individual market. When we think about international travel, it is where that trip originated. And so a trip from the US to France would be accounted for in terms of North American spending in 2024. You can also see here that we break down this travel spend by major category. And so you can see how that breaks out across the regions. And then at bottom right, what our global expenditures look like broken out last year. So $461 billion spent on lodging in 2024, 391 billion on air, 250 billion on food and beverage expenditures, another 227 billion spent on ground transportation, and then 139 billion on other travel expenditures. So all of these expenditures across categories were up significantly in 2024. I think we were up about somewhere in the range of 10% last year. When we look at which of these segments outperformed, air was really led the way in 2024. We saw tremendous growth in air expenditures. I think a lot of that was driven by the return of international travel. You know, as we've recovered from the pandemic, international has been one of the segments that's really lagged, and we saw a lot of that international start to come back online in 2024. We also saw business travelers moving more to the front of the plane in 2024, boosting that average spend per trip. And so that also helped to lift the air numbers last year. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the macroeconomic environment. Some of the metrics that we look at firsthand are these two big ones that are featured on the slide here: what's happening with inflation and what is happening with employment globally. These two tend to have an inverse relationship with one another, meaning that when we see employment doing very well, when we see, or unemployment, I should say, coming down, we see higher rates of inflation and vice versa. And so these are the two metrics that a lot of central bankers are keying in on when they're setting policy. So the Federal Reserve, for example, here in the US has a dual mandate. It's to obtain maximum employment, and it's also to maintain price stability. And so trying to counterbalance those two different factors are a key tenet of monetary policy. So two of the things that we look at when analyzing where we see business travel heading. So inflation, global inflation, this was, the big story coming out of the pandemic. And so we talked ad nauseum about inflation and its impact on travel through 22, 23, 24. The good news is we saw inflation peak in 2022, and we've seen it come down every year since. And so if you look at the table on the left-hand side, and you look at the bottom of that table and look at global inflation, you can see that we had 6.6% growth in price inflation in 23. That moderated to 5.7 in 2024. We expect further moderation. We're seeing further moderation in 2025 at 4.3%. In 2026, the expectation is we're going to be at 3.6%. So in many major economies around the world, we're getting back to those target interest rates, those target inflation rates that will allow central bankers to start to ease monetary policy. And we're starting to see some of that easing around the world. On the other hand, when we look at employment, unemployment rates have also started to come down over the last few years. And in fact, we've seen record lows in terms of global unemployment. We ended 2024 with an unemployment rate globally of 5%. If you look at this chart here on the right, it shows the orange bar is the latest read on unemployment. The yellow bar is the lowest point over the last cycle. And the gray dot shows us where we were at the end of 2019. So essentially just before the pandemic. And so what you can see in this chart is across most of these markets, we're at or near the lowest point in terms of unemployment rates. And in many cases, in most cases, we're below and some significantly below where we were at the end of 2019. So this is key really for business travel. Every 1% change in the unemployment rate translates to about 36 million workers globally. And so obviously the more people that are working, the more opportunity we have for people to be traveling. Okay, so that's some of the good news. Now, let's talk about some of the not so good news. What's happening on the trade front, right? So we've gone away from inflation rates and employment being the key things that are really driving our thinking, at least in the near term to medium term. And we're now focused on trade policy, and in particular, US tariff rates and reciprocal tariffs that we're seeing be applied to the US as tariff rates go up. We all know kind of the way this has materialized. We're including this longer term trend because I think it really helps for perspective to see what we've seen over the last number of decades in terms of, those rates of average tariffs in the US really going down. And this is the story of globalization, right? As we've become a more global marketplace, we've seen more free trade policy. You can see there the NAFTA agreement, we were down to 3%, and we continued to trend lower until we got into 2020. And then obviously the big spike, you can see here, we've called out the average tax rate as they were announced on the so-called Liberation Day. When those big ugly charts came out with the tariff rates that were going to be applied to nations around the world by the US, we were at an average rate of 23%. And we've seen that cool over the past couple of months. So as of June 1st, that was down to about just over 12%. Currently, we're at an average rate of about 11.6%. And so this is critical, obviously, for business travel activity. I think in the short term, the biggest thing is really the uncertainty factor. A lot of companies don't really know how to plan until we really know what these rates are going to look like. Where do we have to start to source, look for new lines of supply chains? What are these deals going to look like? And until all of that gets ironed out, there's going to be some degree of uncertainty. We have seen that uncertainty get reined in a little bit over the last couple of months, which has helped. But we're still far from out of the woods in terms of knowing how to move forward as companies and as countries under the new sort of trade regime that's being set here. So obviously that policy has had implications on uncertainty, global uncertainty, as well as both consumer and business confidence. You can see here on the left-hand side, this is a trade policy uncertainty index that we follow in terms of how that impacts travel expenditures. As you might expect, the more uncertainty that we tend to see from a policy standpoint, the more pressure we see on business travel volume and spending. And so you can see that uncertainty index hit its highest mark on record around those Liberation Day announcements in April of 2025. The good news is that things have cooled off since then over the last couple of months. We have seen some trade agreements, well, not necessarily signed agreements, but at least a framework for trade agreements get put forth across many different global countries with the US. Still a lot more to iron out, but I think we've sort of determined that, we're going to avoid, we think, worst case scenario where we're going to have these sky high, Liberation Day type rates, and we're not going to get down to something that makes more sense on a bilateral, from a bilateral perspective with the US and all of these different nations that were negotiating trade agreements. You can see likewise, consumer confidence hit that cyclical bottom around that same point in time. It was actually a little bit before Liberation Day in March of 2025, but still at those low levels. But we've seen that sort of creep up a little bit. We're still below that mark of 100. That is the long-term average in consumer confidence. But things are a little bit better than what we saw a few months ago. So there's a little bit more ease here. So what do trade and tariffs and how does this policy translate through to global GDP and global inflation? These charts come from an analysis that was done by the OECD that forecasted the impact of trade and tariff policy on global growth as well as on headline inflation. So on the left, you can see we're looking at global growth. The yellow line represents the pre-tariff outlook for global growth. The gray line is the current baseline, and then the orange line is somewhere in between where we end up with some sort of a lighter tariff scenario. And so I'm not going to belabor the numbers in this because this is always changing based on how these agreements are changing. But I think from a high level, it's just important to understand that the higher the rate of tariffs, the more pressure we're going to see on GDP growth, the more pressure we're going to see on companies' travel budgets, and the more pressure we're going to see on travel spending. Likewise, we're going to see more upward pressure on inflation the higher these rates of tariffs. And so the chart on the left shows that over time, as we talked about before, we're seeing this normalization of inflation rates. But we expect that there's going to be more pressure on those inflation rates under a higher tariff regime. And so you can see what that looks like in terms of the OECD's projections. And so this has a lot of implications over where we see business travel headed over the next few years. I think uncertainty is the biggest part of it. Companies really need to understand what policy is going to look like on a country-by-country basis to be able to set travel budgets, really be able to understand where and how they're going to invest in their businesses over the next few years, and just keeping an eye on inflation, which is going to impact everything, both from a business and consumer standpoint. And then also, I'll talk about in a minute, is also going to impact, of course, where we go with monetary policy. So looking at how this actually translates through to GDP, this is a forecast that comes from the IMF. It gets released quarterly. I had presented the spring forecast at convention. This is the most up-to-date forecast that we have. It's from July of 2025. And so you can see on the left-hand side, the IMF is expecting global growth. Well, we saw 3.3% global growth last year. I should say global growth has been performing really well over the last few years. In fact, 2024 was the fourth year that we had above 3% growth globally. That has not happened since the early 2000s. And so what we have here and what we're working with is a really strong economy. And so I think despite what's happening with trade policy and with tariffs, that's why we're continuing to see relative strength in the global economy and relative strength in business travel across markets. We do expect that growth is weakening in 2025. We're expecting about 3% growth This is up from the spring forecast, which had about 2.8% growth. Again, that forecast was following those Liberation Day announcements. We've seen some trade deals be put into place or some frameworks put into place that's helping to ease our expectations for negativity around GDP growth this year and next year. So 3% growth this year, 3.1% is the expectation next year. To put that in perspective, before the Liberation Day announcement, so if we go back to these projections at the end of 2024, the IMF was expecting about 3.3% growth in 2025 and another 3.3% growth in 2026. So shaving off about 0.2 to 0.3% in terms of GDP growth. Okay, so what does all this mean for the prospects for global business travel? So looking ahead, this is a bar chart that shows travel expenditures year by year. It's going back to 2019, so pre-pandemic. We saw $1.4 trillion, $1.4 trillion spent globally on business travel. We saw that big decline in 2020 to 661 billion. And we've really grown our way out of that over the last few years. We've had tremendous growth, in particular, looking at 2022 and 2023, with nearly 50% growth in 22, another 30% growth in 23, and then we saw another 10% growth in 2024. We are seeing that growth moderate, as you might expect, as we recover from the pandemic. But we're still seeing relatively strong growth, expecting 6.6% growth in travel expenditures in 2025. That would be another record high at over 1.5, almost $1.6 trillion in expenditures globally. And then you can see when we look at this over the long run, what that looks like. We start to see growth moderate as we get to the out years of our forecast and normalize, 6.3% in 28 and 5.4% in 2029. And we're expecting to top $2 trillion in global business travel expenditures by the time we get to the out year of our forecast. I thought it was important in looking at our forecast to share our forecast from last year and how that looks next to our forecast from this year, because this year's forecast, like what we see from the IMF in terms of the GDP forecast, this forecast bakes into trade and tariff policy into our expectations for business travel over the next few years. The yellow bars and orange line here represent the forecast from 2024, and this is looking at this year's travel expenditures. And we're also looking at this year's travel expenditures in this year's, the 2025 forecast, the charcoal line and gray bars in this chart. And so what's clear here is that there has been a downward revision. I just talked about the fact that we expect to see $2 trillion in expenditures by the time we get out to 2029. We were expecting to hit that mark a year earlier in last year's forecast. So we were expecting to hit $2 trillion in 2028. So we're still seeing growth. We still see a relatively strong and vibrant global business travel market, but we do see growth slowing. We were expecting about 8% growth in last year's forecast over the entirety of the forecast horizon, and now that's moderated to about 7% on average over that forecast horizon. So let's take a look at that region by region and see what that looks like. And so, as you might imagine, these adjustments to our forecast have not been uniform across regions. And when you look at the regions that have been most impacted, it's not surprising to see those regions that are more tied to trade with the US are the ones that are really being impacted in terms of downgrades to the forecast. And so again, the yellow bars here show our forecast for business travel spending growth in each of these regions from last year. And the charcoal bar shows the forecast for each of these regions from this year's forecast. And then that dot shows the differences between the two. And so you can see the largest downgrade to our forecast is for Asia Pacific, which has been downgraded by 5.3%. We've also seen big downgrades to Western Europe at 4.5%. Important to note that this forecast was completed in late spring, early summer. Again, we have seen, sort of trade deals put in place, the one with the EU obviously being very notable here. I think if we went back and revised these numbers, we might have a little bit stronger expectations for the back half of the year in 2025 than we had a couple of months ago. And then North America obviously downgraded as well, an impact on the Canadian market with trade, and the impact that we're seeing in the US from this policy has led to a 2% downgrade in our forecast for North America. It's also important to take a look at nominal versus real GDP growth to really understand the impact of inflation on our forecast. And this is really important to us because what we're forecasting in the BTI is business travel spending and not necessarily business travel volume. And so if you're thinking about this, from a travel manager's perspective and looking at, yes, you're analyzing your spend, but you're also looking at what is my travel volume and do I have more people? Am I putting more people on the road this year than I was last year? Will I be putting more people on the road next year? So we like to take a look at that nominal spending, which is this gold line in this chart here. These are the numbers that I've been talking about. So $1.4 trillion in nominal spending prior to the pandemic. As of this year, we're expecting $1.6 trillion in total spending. But the orange line helps us to look at that when we adjust for inflation. So this is real business travel spending. So we've deflated these numbers. We've used a base year of 2000. So everything in the orange line represents spending as if they were in $2,000. So pulling out the effects of inflation. So in 2019, in real terms, we had $963 billion spent globally on travel. When we look at 2025, our expectation is that we're going to have, on a real basis, so again, adjusted for inflation, $829 billion in expenditures. And this is important because we're still about 15% below on an inflation adjusted basis where we were prior to the pandemic. So even though actual numbers that include inflation are higher than where we were in 2019, we're still lagging by about 15%. And so this gives us a good indication that while spending has fully recovered, business travel volumes have not. And in fact, we don't think business travel volume is going to recover until about 2028 or 2029. So I mentioned up front when I was talking a little bit about the methodology and what's included in our analysis that we're looking at business travel expenditures by industry sector. This chart here helps us to map out performance in those industry sectors. And so what you're seeing here, the bubbles included in these charts are major industries around the globe. And the size of that bubble tells us how much spending on business travel in 2024 each of these industry sectors had. And then we've divided these industry sectors into these four quadrants. And we're looking at these across the x-axis, the bottom axis from left to right is showing us how each of these industries has recovered since the pandemic. So we're looking at spending in each of these industry sectors relative to what was spent in 2019 prior to the pandemic. So that's where they sit on this chart from left to right. And then from top to bottom, we're looking at how we're expecting those sectors to perform in terms of business travel expenditures over the next 5 years. So those lower on that axis, we're expecting relatively weaker growth. Those higher on the axis, relatively stronger growth. And then we break those into these four quadrants that you can see on the chart here. So the resurgent, top left, those are industry sectors that underperformed since the pandemic, but we're actually expecting them to outperform over the next few years. So transportation, warehousing, wholesale trade. Very, very important to note here, these two industries very tied to what's happening with trade policy, global trade, tariffs. And so we're keeping a close eye on these two sectors, which could very easily fall into that lagging space depending on how these trade deals get negotiated. In terms of lagging sectors, these are the sectors that have been lagging over the next few years. We expect them to continue to lag over the next few years. Retail trade, public administration, manufacturing, the big one, right? Manufacturing comprises about a third of global business travel expenditures. So it's really key for manufacturing to recover. We've seen manufacturing really lag, not just over the last 5 years, but over the last 10 years. It's really an emerging market story. We need to get China back, seeing really healthy, not necessarily double-digit growth rates, but seeing China back, consistently above 5, closer to 10% growth every year to really drive what we're seeing in terms of manufacturing spend. In terms of the stabilizing sectors, these are the sectors that outperformed over the last few years, but we expect them to underperform from a business travel spending perspective over the next few. Education, real estate, utilities. And so you tend to see really interest-sensitive sectors here. As interest rates have risen, we see a slowdown in terms of utilities. We see a slowdown in terms of real estate spending. And then lastly, the outperforming sectors, finance and insurance. These are the sectors that have really outperformed, and we expect to continue to outperform over the next few years. Human health and social work, professional and business services, information and communication. And so very important to think about, the markets that you're operating in terms of these different industry sectors. So looking at region by region is very important in terms of how business travel is going to perform, but maybe even more important is what industry sector. I mean, if you're a travel manager at a company like NVIDIA or Facebook, the world is going to look very different over the next 5 years than if you're working in retail, trade, or manufacturing, right? Okay, want to end just with a couple of sort of high level, zoom the lens out a little bit slides. If you've seen any of these presentations before, or if you've read our reports, you've probably seen this. This is a timeline of global business travel expenditures. And really all we're looking at is spending growth in business travel going back to 2000, and then really characterizing that spending growth in all these various different areas. So you can see kind of the Great Recession, you can see the recovery, obviously what happened during the COVID crisis, and then this tremendous recovery that we've seen over the last number of years. And now we're in this, what we call the post-pandemic stabilization phase. So we're starting to see business travel spending normalize, expecting as we get, as I talked about towards the out year of our forecast, more normal spending growth somewhere in the 5 to 6% range. But we're really focused on what happens with trade policy and the uncertainty around that over the next few years, which is really going to have implications over where things head, especially, looking in 2026. The more that we can get done on the trade front, the less uncertainty we have. I mean, we still have, trade going to the Supreme Court that's not going to be decided until November sometime. And so we've got to really get through this. We've got to get more of these trade deals, or at least framework around these trade deals done, to really unlock the potential of global business travel over the next few years. So just looking at some of the key trends and forecast risks that we're watching very closely. Number one, policy uncertainty, and in top of the list in terms of policy, trade and tariffs, no doubt about that, in terms of where we see business travel headed over the next few years. Also keeping a close eye on debt levels. So we see countries around the globe having higher and higher debt levels. When we look at average debt to GDP ratios, prior to the pandemic, we were at about 85%. We're now at about 95%, and many countries much worse than 95%. And so that's worrisome, because it gives a lot less room for fiscal policy, for spending. And so if we do start to see economic weakness, we start to see unemployment rates rise, there's really a lot less room, because of the debt levels that we have globally, to be able to respond to that from a fiscal standpoint, right? And so very important to get debt under control. We also see a lot higher interest rates. So the debt service, to pay for that debt is a lot higher than it was just a few years ago. So something we're keeping a close eye on. Inflation. Talked about inflation. That was the thing that we were really watching in 23, 22, 23, even 24. And now, as we start to see it normalize, we're starting to feel good about it. We have the impact of trade and tariffs. We're yet to really know what that is going to be. We know that there is going to be some upward pressure on inflation, so something to keep a close eye on. And then how that translates over to monetary policy. Central bankers have to look at this inflation and try and judge, through all of this uncertainty, what is inflation going to look like, and also being able to maintain, full employment levels. And then lastly, AI and labor market transformation. Won't go into detail with this. We could talk for hours about the impacts of technology on labor markets and displacement. And I think it's going to have a lot of implications, the way we see some of these shifts over the next few years on where business travel goes. And there's going to be winners and losers in terms of sectors of the economy and regions of the world. Okay, so with that, we're going to talk a little bit about the profile of the global business traveler, and take a look at some payment and transaction trends. And for that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Edward Galvin from Visa. Edward.
Thank you, John, and for your partnership. Thank GBTA and Rockport for helping us bring this valuable data to the market. It's always fascinating to see and hear what's going on the economic side, and then parlay that into what's happening across business travel in general. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about, as John said, the evolving profile of the business traveler, I guess. And then we look at what's happening with cards and payments. And we've been very fortunate to get some feedback from the surveys over the past few years, more recent years, on with questions directly to the actual business travelers themselves. So our analysis shows that a business travel landscape is not only strong, but also evolving. And by a significant majority, travelers continue to engage in business travel, clearly seeing value in their journeys, a strong alignment between travel and business outcomes. We're seeing a continuous trend towards blending of work and leisure, which indicates that travel expectations are changing. And companies, accordingly should consider their policies to meet these new norms and preferences. And the data point there, 59% blend business and personal travel the same or more often. Just another couple of data points, 81% viewed the same or more in the past year versus 2019, right? We'll talk a little bit about this more later on, but the cost of the business trip, estimated spend on their last business trip was up relative to last year. And then the one I like looking at is the top purposes, right? 30%, 37% are for seminar or training, 27% convention or conferences, and 24% sales and account management and meetings. So there are some great data points coming through the analysis. I guess double clicking deeper on that specific point, the top travel purposes by region. We looked at each of the regions and we asked the travelers, like, why are they traveling, right? And you know, we see that business travelers in North America and Europe cite the same reasons, albeit in different rankings, which include conventions, conferences, seminar trainings, consulting, professional services, whereas AP in Latin America, business travelers cite sales and account management as their our partner management meetings and their top 3 reasons for most of their most recent business trips. I find that interesting. I would have thought that sales and account management would also cite in North America and Europe, but it's obviously not what we're hearing back from the travelers. I think there's been an evolution here in that what I find is that a lot of sales and account management is actually done right now at conferences, given that, you know, organizations are in different phases of being in, you know, return to office mode. We also took a look at the global business traveler view, and we asked travelers around the world about their last overnight business trip. And we asked them, you know, about the transportation used, accommodation used, and the class of service, etc. Okay. Interestingly, we find that they use a host of transportation modes, as one would expect, while on the road, include airplanes at 43%, personal car at 29%, which I found interesting, rental cars at 19%, rideshare Uber 15%, public transport 15%, and so forth. Train and rail are higher among business travelers in both Europe and Asia Pacific at 29% and 35% respectively. The use of personal cars at 34%, rental cars at 31%, and rideshare at 21% is higher among North American business travelers compared to other regions around the world. And hotels are overwhelmingly used by business travelers regardless of region, with 8 in 10 travelers reporting they stayed in a hotel on their last business trip. We asked business travelers about the class of service they flew on their last business trip. We found that economy and coach is the most frequent class flown, with half of the business travelers flying coach, and about 1 in 3 flew business class. Business travelers in the Middle East, 58% are more likely than travelers in other regions to fly in coach class. Regarding accommodation, in terms of the hotel type used, business travelers stayed in mid-scale hotels most frequently, and about a quarter stayed in upscale hotels, but 1 in 5, 18% staying in a budget property. Less than 1 in 10 stayed at a luxury property. So you can see the breakout of the hotel stays as well. We always look at and try and assess the average cost of a business trip per region and how that varies. And this year, the average cost of a business trip averaged at 1,128. Last year, the average cost of the trip averaged at 834 per person per trip. In fact, in all 4 regions, the average cost of business trip was higher than last year. Okay, so inflation likely accounts for some of the increases, as does the higher price in some markets. And in 2024, the average inflation, as John just outlined, globally was approximately 6.0. In 2020, it averages about 4.3. So maybe creating some of the reasons there. I also want to note that this is self-reported spending by business travelers, regardless if they work for a company that has managed program travel or not. And these spending averages include managed and unmanaged travel spend. So just taking another view, we looked at some of the role of cards and payments and asked some questions around that. And I guess from my point of view, regardless of the region, approximately 7 in 10, 69% business travelers report they have a company credit card, right? Fewer travelers in Latin America, 57% of corporate credit cards compared with travelers in other regions. It's worth noting that only like a third, 34% of business travelers said they're mandated to use it. In LAC, only a quarter of the business travelers are required to use a company credit card, while 41% of travelers in Asia Pacific say it's their choice whether to use a corporate card when traveling for work or not. Right, and I think that that mandating certainly has creates variations across the various different regions. We also note that that about 49% of travelers who are not part of a managed program or who have a corporate card are required to use card for all their business travel spending. Okay. We also look at business travelers' use of corporate cards on the trip, right? And among the business travelers who have a corporate card spend as a percentage of purchases is fairly consistent. We see that about 2 in 5, about 37% of business travelers globally use their corporate cards for less than half of the purchases spent while on the road, while 1 in 5, 21% of European business travelers say they use their corporate card for less than half of their spending while on the road. So there's just some interesting dynamics on the actual spend on card while people are traveling. We also asked, this is a newer question on collecting personal benefits from card. And of course, like this is one of the big, let's say, opportunity challenge points. People want to use their personal cards because they can collect the benefits. So among the question was, you mentioned your company provides you with a corporate credit card. Does your company allow you to collect or redeem any personal benefits associated with a corporate card? So among business travelers who have a corporate card, average is 69%. Many report they're permitted to collect personal benefits from their card. Lounge access being 67%, mileage accrual 62%, and shopping discounts 61%. Okay, so I think that's a good index on that. While people do have a corporate credit card, they're still able to assess some of the points and benefits that are associated around that actual card. We looked at the varying different card types, right? And we looking at different card types as part of the corporate card program. We find that European business travelers are less likely to say they have a corporate card as part of their company program, and note that 8% of European travelers who say that their company does not have a card at all as part of their company program. Virtual cards, so I mean, like there's varying types. There's lodge cards, virtual cards, and corporate cards, or none. Our virtual cards are relatively consistent across the world, with approximately 1 in 5 business travelers reporting their virtual cards as part of their program. So we see a continued increase and rise on virtual cards as part of the card program, and especially probably post-pandemic. Some companies did not reissue plastics; they moved to an exclusive virtual card model instead. We asked about the mobile wallet, right? Approximately 6 in 10 business travelers with a corporate card have added it to a mobile wallet, right? And we find that about 2/3 of business travelers with corporate cards have it to wallet. But travelers in Asia Pacific have the highest rate of loading their corporate cards into their mobile wallet. We see an increase in the number of North American business travelers that have loaded their cards to their mobile wallet. That's 59% compared to last year, which was 49%. And we see somewhat of a similar trend on the consumer side as well. I think post-pandemic, there's been a relatively strong increase in tap to pay and having cards, having a consumer card, a credit card loaded to the actual virtual wallet. So we're seeing some of that play out on the business side as well. Finally, on average, North American travelers, about 53% of business travelers who have a corporate card say they use it for approximately 10 to 20% of the time when making business spend transactions. Whereas business travelers in AP, Asia Pacific, about 45% are a lot more likely to use their corporate card for 20% or more of their business travel expenses compared to travelers in other regions, right? So again, I think the goal is to get as many transactions as possible onto the actual card for that business trip, which makes it easier for program management, for expense management, for reconciliation, and for general business travel as well. Okay, so that's the wrap up of I guess some of the trends we're seeing and data points we're getting back from the business travelers. Again, these are we've only been doing this for probably 2 or 3 years, and you know, as we build up more of these data points, we can draw longer term assumptions on what's happening and evolving and changing at the business travel level. But it's certainly looks like a positive move right now. So I think we're going to take some questions at this point, and I think
Thank you, Edward and John. for that presentation. Anybody, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box down below. You'll be able to see it on probably on the lower part of your screen. We do have a couple of questions already, but please feel free to, again, type in your questions in the box. And I also want to make an announcement just to remind everybody that all registrants will receive a copy of the presentation or the actual PowerPoint presentation, as well as a link to the recording as well. So just keep your eyes out for that. That'll appear in your box in a couple of days. So the first question I have seen, and I think that this is maybe best for John, it's about interest rates. And the question is, well, with the recent interest rate cut in the US, what do you think the impact will be on business travel spending for the rest of this year, 2025? Do you have any thoughts around that?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think, Chris, it's going to be stimulative to some degree, especially here in the US, right? And so anytime that we've got a lower interest rate environment, and I think the good news in terms of the cut is we've got a Federal Reserve that's cutting into strength and not cutting into weakness. So a lot of times when you see interest rates cuts, it's because we see a recession on the horizon. We're starting to see a lot of disruption in the labor markets, and that's not what is happening here. The Fed is cutting sort of preemptively. We do see a little bit of weakness in the labor market, but the bottom line is we've seen inflation stall out. And so I think the fact that we're cutting is going to be stimulative. I don't think it's going to have huge impacts on our numbers this year. If we can continue this cycle of cuts, and we continue to see good data on the inflation front and on the jobs front, I think when we get into 2026, it's really going to make a big difference, here in the US. And then the other thing I'll say about the interest rate cut in this is more about international travel. A trend that we've seen as of late is some weakening in the US dollar, right? And so there has been some big currency impacts if you're a company that's doing a lot of travel overseas, right? And so, for example, travel from Europe to the US is getting relatively cheaper, and vice versa. And so depending on, what your company's travel trends look like from region to region, I think the more, as we see interest rates cut more and more here in the US, if we can continue on this loosening cycle, we're going to see a continuation in the weakening of the dollar, which is going to, change the trade flows and change the cost of travel from one market to the next.
Great. And we have another question asking if we have any specific insights into forecasts for India, the Indian market.
I don't have the numbers here off the top of my head, Chris, but yeah, I mean, India has been, one of the key drivers in Asia Pacific and has really helped to kind of pick up the slack, so to speak, as we've seen a slowdown in China, and we expect that to continue. There are certainly challenges that we're looking at in India, but I think the growth in consumption in the market and the potential in terms of population, and you look at business travel spend per capita, we think over the next certainly 10 years or so, India is going to be one of the leading business travel markets.
Okay, right, super. We have another question about cards. Maybe this would be good for Edward. Do you have any thoughts on why company-provided corporate cards vary by region? Or might vary by region?
Sorry, vary by
region, but from a regional perspective, the slide that you showed, the different regions that had
the ability. Yeah, I think a lot of it is driven by what's traditionally happening in the consumer side, right? Some regions are more card savvy than others, right? And that's just the nature of what happened on the consumer side. We see a lag on the B2B side. We see somewhat of a lag on what happens with B2B cards relative to what happened on the consumer side. So if a region has high adoption of cards in the consumer side, well, we'd see a similar trend in the B2B side. right? And I think that explains some of the variations in some of the regions. I will also say that post-pandemic, we've seen this massive shift towards what we call the consumerization of B2B and corporate payments, in that there's been a massive push from the travelers to have the exact same experience on the business travel side that they're having on their consumer side. And that has really, and I've seen some of this play out in figures, that has really increased the adoption of mobile wallets, as an example, right? You see in North America, it's up 10% in a year. That's a lot. We think about, the period of time. So I think it's kind of historically what has happened in the region, what's happening on the consumer side, but we've seen a big push on more adoption, if you will, in the past couple of years, especially post-pandemic.
Great. We have another card-related question, Edward, and the question is about, have you seen certain types of payments growing for business travel? And if so, why might that be the case? So the different types of cards, I think that you mentioned, and it's anything growing?
Yeah, I think there's more there. I've seen hotel, so airline has been pretty established, right? Because that was captured originally with lodge cards, right? I've seen more use cases on the hotel spend grow. I've also seen like OTAs, online travel agency, adopt card payments into their payment flows, right? So let's say well, it's not a specific business travel, but an OTA needs to pay a hotel for rooms bought, right? So they've been using virtual accounts for that model as well. So I would say, to answer your question specifically, it's in the hotel use case, number one. Then also OTAs are driving, online travel agents are driving the adoption and the usage of card spend as well.
Okay. Great, thank you. We have another question about, it looks like more of an economic question, but do you see a long-term impact on domestic travel spend and inbound travel spend to the US with the convergence of a weaker dollar, tariff impacts, and a weakening labor market?
So yeah, I can take that one, Chris.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I think it's hard to put all those factors together and say that there is going to be no impact. I think the degree to which there is an impact obviously depends on the magnitude of a lot of those things, right? And so, I think the weaker dollar is actually going to support, in some cases, maybe not spending levels, but travel volumes, because it makes travel more affordable for international markets coming into the US. So that will actually sort of counterbalance some of the impacts of what we're seeing from a trade policy perspective. But I think there's no doubt that, if it's more difficult and becomes more costly, not necessarily because of a currency standpoint, but because of just a general inflation standpoint, that we're going to see lower travel volumes to the US. I mean, on the leisure side, we know that we've already seen travel impacts just based on sentiment, right? There's plenty of consumers that say, I would rather not, we can't negotiate a trade deal, or we're going to spend our monies elsewhere than the US. And I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't companies that have that same sentiment. Is it going to be to the degree that we see on the consumer side? Probably not. But so we'll be keeping a close eye on it. We don't have a lot of data as of yet. There is some data from the Commerce Department that we can look at that looks at trends. Since tariffs were enacted, we see that international inbound travel is down about 6% on a year-over-year basis, just isolating those few months. We don't really have a lot of detail yet on how much of that is leisure and how much of that is corporate travel. But yes, I think there certainly, we can expect there to be some impacts, and it really depends on kind of where we land from a policy standpoint on how big those impacts are.
Okay. I'll just add to that, John. We're keeping a close eye on certain industries where there'll be an impact from supply chain replumbing, right? So that's going to come down the line, right? We haven't seen, I think you shared that, but we haven't seen the impacts of, of the tariffs yet in the supply chain to a major degree. But certain industries are looking at replumbing their supply chain based on what the tariffs are going to do. So I think that will drive variances in business travel spend as well into the future. So just a data point to add to that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, Edward. And I think that's going to change the way we see travel flows too, right? I mean, it's as supply chains, I mean, as we know, business travel tends to follow goods and services, right? And so it matters where those supply chains are in terms of where folks are going to be traveling to. And so it definitely has some pretty big implications. I mean, these companies aren't going to stop doing business just because they can't get the inputs they need because they're too expensive from the US. They're going to find another source for those inputs, right?
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. We're at the top of the hour, and so I want to thank both John and Edward for taking the time today to walk us through some of the key findings of the BTI. And again, all registrants on today's webinar will receive a copy of the recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation. In that PowerPoint on the last slide, you'll also see John and Edward's email addresses. So feel free to reach out to them or feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the BTI. Happy to answer those for you. And with that, I want to again thank everyone for their time today, and thank you again for participating. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks all.